All right, it looks like we have the bulk of the crowd in for now, so I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm really excited to host this Composting 101 webinar with Urban Roots London. Just before we get started, I'd like to go through the land acknowledgements. So the Westminster Pond Centre acknowledges that it stands on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Gundapavwak peoples, whom for time immemorial have had a long-standing relationship with the land and water that surround us. We also acknowledge the local First Nation communities in the area, which are Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, of whom continue to be stewards of the land today. We at the Westminster Pond Centre place high value on the significant contributions, both historical and contemporary, of local and regional First Nations, and strive daily to work and grow alongside communities towards a better future. Now, just some general housekeeping. We ask that you please keep your mics muted during this session, just to keep down the background noise. If you have any comments or questions throughout the webinar, you can ask them through the chat box, and they will be answered at the end of the session at the Q&R. So this webinar will be recorded, and you'll be released to you in about 48 hours. And at the end, we please ask that you stay around to follow the link for our survey. We really value your feedback. This webinar is supported by the Signal Boost Initiative, which is a project of Reforest London and the Westminster Pond Centre for Environment and Sustainability. The Centre is developing a community hub with services and programming that promote environmental excellence, sustainability, health, and well-being across our region. The Signal Boost Initiative is a program of the Westminster Pond Centre, which allows us to dramatically increase the number of public and volunteer environmental educational opportunities that are available in London. And the Signal Boost Initiative wouldn't be made possible without our funders, which are supported by the Ontario Trillium Foundation and Canada Life. And we ask you to connect with us. You can find the Westminster Pond Centre on all the social medias, and you can stay up to date on new events that are coming up at reforestlondon.ca. Now, I would love to introduce our host for the evening, Ben Wilcox. He is the Director of Farm Operators at Urban Roots London. With a passion for food, both growing it and cooking it, he aims to facilitate the growth of as much food for the community as possible, while doing his best in educating the people around him and what they can do to contribute to effecting positive change regarding key issues like food security and climate change. Last year, he oversaw the growth of distribution of over 13,000 pounds of produce with Urban Roots London, and he is continuing and working towards another successful season on the farm. And without further ado, I will hand the mic off to Ben.
Hey everybody, I'm just going to get my screen set up here so we can all see the PowerPoint. All right, so let's get started. Welcome. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming today. As Sarah said, I'm Ben, the Director of Farm Operations for Urban Roots London, which is basically just a fancy title for a farm manager. Really excited to be able to share this information with you, putting the process of composting into the bigger picture of waste management and how you can contribute to this from your home while producing a great soil amendment. So to start, here's a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what Urban Roots is and what we do there, just in case anybody is unfamiliar. We'll dive into what the process of composting actually is and how we can properly control it. And then we'll kind of move into why it's so important, putting into the context of waste management, its environmental impact, and what we as individuals can get out of the process. And then we'll move into the specific different methods that we can use at scale and in our backyards, as well as even systems small enough to fit under your kitchen sink. And then I'll briefly just at the end kind of discuss what we do at Urban Roots as far as our community composting program goes. So if you're not familiar, Urban Roots is a not-for-profit market farm located right here in London. We focus on using sustainable ecological practices while farming on underused land in the city to grow all sorts of seasonal produce available direct to community members starting in mid to late May. Our goal is to have a self-sustaining operation while providing as much fresh organic produce to our community as possible. We aim to accomplish this by using our model of thirds. So under our model of thirds, we donate no less than a third of the produce we grow to organizations like My Sister's Place, Queer Events, and Crouch Neighborhood Resource Center. We sell a third of our produce direct to consumers at our farm gate sales and through various community markets at an affordable rate, that is to say like a below market rate. The last third of our produce is sold at wholesale rates to local restaurants and businesses that strive to support local sustainable agriculture. During our season, folks like Reimagine Co. and Grace Restaurant are a couple examples of where you can see our produce put to use. Through this model, we've distributed over 40,000 pounds of produce to date. Our primary location is at Norland Ave, near the intersection of Hamilton Road and Highbury Road. That's 21 Norland Ave to be specific. And in my last slide there, that is a drone picture of our farm. Yeah, so we've been farming at the 21 Norland Ave location since 2017. This past year was my first year as the farm manager there. Last year, however, in partnership with Siloam United Church, Urban Roots developed another site on their property. We've begun establishing a food forest along with a smaller scale agricultural system that mirrors our operations at Norland Ave. The produce grown there supports Siloam's community pantry and Glencairn Resource Center. So now that we're all up to speed on where I'm coming from, let's dive into the composting. So what is composting? Like all biological life is composed of organic matter and eventually decomposes through processes that just are already happening in nature. Composting is a way for humans to control and enhance the decomposition of waste organic matter to produce usable soil amendments that can improve the tilth, moisture retention, and structure of our soil, while adding some nutrients and promoting microbial activity in the soil. Using the methods we talk about today, we can ensure the safety, quality, and consistency of our compost while accelerating the process depending on which methods we choose. So the actual action of decomposition in nature or in our compost piles is performed largely by microorganisms, both bacterial and fungal, along with earthworms and insects. Many of the methods of composting are aimed at enhancing the environment to best suit microorganisms that perform this decomposition. So to maintain an optimal composting system, we need to understand how to control the environment we are creating for the decomposer organisms. There are 5 main factors to keep in mind in this process, which you can see on this slide, but we'll talk about right now. So first off, we need to make sure we're providing these organisms with the right balance of food. Like all organisms need a nice balanced diet for their health. But when we're talking about feedstock for a colony of microorganisms in our compost pile, we're mostly talking about 2 nutrients, namely carbon and nitrogen. There are other nutrients that are important for microbial activity, but they're not generally rate limiting in that like they're available in abundance in the inputs that we put into our compost pile. So like I said, it's the carbon and nitrogen that we need to make sure we have enough of each of those to maintain a proper pile. Carbon provides the raw energy needed by microorganisms, with 50% of the mass of microbes being made up of carbon, while nitrogen is essential in synthesizing cellular components necessary for survival. So synthesizing proteins, coenzymes, and things like that are really mediated by the amount of nitrogen. The optimal carbon to nitrogen ratio in a compost pile system is roughly 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. When the ratio of carbon to nitrogen is lower than 30:1, the excess nitrogen is released as ammonia, which can have an unpleasant odor and is an environmental pollutant. Ratios higher than 30:1 don't provide enough nitrogen to the microorganisms, which results in lower populations and cool and slow decomposition. Sorry. So when there's not enough nitrogen, as I was saying, this leads to a slower decomposition process. Finished compost will have a ratio closer to 15:1 carbon to nitrogen, as nutrient metabolism by the microorganisms releases carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, and some of the carbon is stabilized in the actual bodies of the microorganisms. So now in at-home composting, this won't be an exact science. You can find all sorts of tables online estimating carbon to nitrogen ratio of various compostable materials. But generally, you can think of these materials in groups of greens and browns. Greens being nitrogen-rich material and browns being carbon-rich material. Examples of greens are food scraps generally, grass clippings, manure, and these all break down relatively quickly. Whereas brown materials are things like dry leaves, wood chips, sawdust, and branches and things like that, which break down much more slowly. And just when thinking about your carbon to nitrogen ratio or greens to browns, keep in mind that some browns like bark or larger sticks break down even more slowly than other brown material, which can affect the bioavailability of their carbon content. However, this can largely be mitigated by our next area of control, particle size. So the size of the materials to be composted affects the overall surface area available to the microorganisms. Smaller particle size means a larger surface area and therefore faster decomposition. However, particles that are too small can become compacted, which limits airflow in the composting system. Consistency of particle size across the pile will also lead to a more uniform temperature. And oxygen flow and temperature are our next two factors to keep in mind. So there are different mechanisms of decomposition in nature, namely aerobic and anaerobic. So anaerobic means no oxygen is required for the decomposition, and aerobic means that oxygen is required for the decomposition process. And you can compost both aerobically and anaerobically. However, I've chosen to not really incorporate anaerobic methods in this talk, namely because they're slower, stinkier, they are sludgier, and they have kind of negative environmental impacts. So I chose to exclude those. So oxygen is a really important factor to monitor and control in your aerobic system, because more oxygen being available to the microorganisms allows them to metabolize the organic matter faster. And as more metabolism takes place in a shorter time window, more heat is produced, which drives the temperature of the compost pile as a whole up. The temperature of your compost pile is an important factor to monitor, as certain temperature thresholds can destroy pathogens and unwanted wildflower seeds, ensuring the safety and cleanliness of your finished compost. So 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius is the temperature to aim for to achieve these results. Temperature can also be used to monitor the activity of the microbes in the pile and help determine when your compost pile is beginning to cure, which we'll go into more detail about that at the end of the talk. The last factor in controlling your compost pile is moisture content. And microorganisms living in your compost pile need water to survive. And that water helps transport and release nutrients throughout the pile, making them available for microorganisms. Too dry of a pile will have limited microbial activity, while too wet of a pile won't have enough oxygen for the microbes to do their thing. So we have a good idea of what composting is, some factors to keep in mind when we're composting, but let's look at why composting is so important. So it's important to put it into the greater context of managing our waste, as we produce a lot of waste as a species, much of which is food waste and organic materials. In fact, in Ontario, 32% of our waste is organic waste, accounting for a whopping 3.7 million tons a year. As this graphic shows, 47% of food waste in Canada is from consumers. This means this is an area that we as citizens can collectively have a huge impact on. When food waste goes to a landfill, it decomposes anaerobically, which means it produces a greenhouse gas called methane, which is 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. To put that into a perspective globally, if global food waste was a country, it would be the third largest producer of greenhouse gases behind China and the United States. You can see by this graph that food waste around the world accounts for over 4 gigatons of CO2 released annually. So when food waste is incorporated into an aerobic compost system, about a third of the carbon is stabilized in the finished compost, so that carbon is sequestered from the atmosphere, while the remaining carbon is released as carbon dioxide. So I bring that up to illustrate that although composting has a far lower carbon footprint than disposing of organic waste in a landfill, it's still not a perfect solution. The EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency of the US, put together this little graphic, and it showcases the most impactful ways we can reduce food waste, which I think can be applied on a household level as well, namely the top level. The best way to reduce our carbon footprint is to reduce food wastage from the source. So obviously, producing less of a surplus of food in the first place would be the best, but from our own households, we can plan our consumption of perishable foods as to not waste as much as possible. And if we all focus on that collectively, then, like I said before, we can have like a serious impact on the emissions that are produced from our organic waste. So of the over 2 million tons of organic waste that's created by residential sources in Ontario per year, only about 50% is currently being diverted from landfills. Doubling that amount of diversion would result in reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 1.1 megatons, which is equivalent to getting 260,000 cars off of the road each year. So I'd like to bring it back to, I assume most of us here are coming from London area. So we're going to bring it back to hyper-local emissions. The City of London has some composting capacity currently, in that the Enviro depots collect and accept yard waste. This yard waste is then composted at the Arva Tri-Recycling using the outdoor windrow method, which is something that we'll discuss shortly. The finished compost is then available for sale to residents of London, which I'm sure many of you know. Some people might have purchased some of that. That being said, we're the largest municipality in Ontario that doesn't have an active residential green bin program. Green bin programs are the equivalent to blue bins for organic waste. They vary somewhat throughout the province and what can be included, but generally speaking, they can include food waste, cooking oils, compostable paper, while some even include pet waste, diapers, and yard waste. Fortunately, a green bin program has been approved in London in the 2020 budget, but the rollout has been delayed due to COVID until this coming fall. So fall 2022, we should start seeing the rollout of the green bin program. And the plan is to begin the program in stages, with it being in full operation by early 2023. So not only is this a critical from an environmental perspective, but also from a pragmatic perspective for our waste management of the city. We currently only divert 45% of our municipal solid waste in London, and our landfill is expected to reach its capacity in 2024. So that 45% includes all of our reusing, all of our recycling efforts, and all of our current organics diversions. But in order to be approved by the Ministry of Environment for an expansion of our landfill, we need to divert at least 60% of our waste from the landfill. So according to the waste recycling strategy for the City of London, which was published in 2014, about 36% of the waste going to our landfills is food waste. So by capturing that food waste, we can easily exceed the 60% diversion requirement and hopefully largely eliminate our methane producing organic waste contributions to our landfill going forward. So that's all to say. I know we're all here to learn about how we can use our own organic waste to produce our own compost, but not everybody wants to do that. So having a agreement program in place in the city is a really critical step in the right direction. For those of us who do our own composting, we not only get the knowledge that we're contributing to positively dealing with our organic waste, but we also get to reap the benefits of the final product. Adding compost to your soil increases the amount of organic matter in your soil, which in turn can boost the microbiological activity in your soil. So that last statement is like, it's a little bit controversial, but microbes generally feed on organic material and other microbes. So adding more to your soil by proxy should increase the amount of microbiological activity in your soil. It also improves water retention, which then reduces erosion and can lead to reduced needs for fertilizers and other soil conditioners. So we've got a good understanding now of both the process of composting and why it is so critical for managing our waste and the impact that can have on our greenhouse gas emissions. So let's talk about the different methods of composting. We'll start by briefly talking about some macro level methods so we can understand how we can process these organic wastes at like a municipal level, and perhaps give some people ideas if they have access to larger spaces and the resources to compost at a larger scale. And then we'll go into much more detail about methods that we can all kind of use at home to produce compost in our backyards or even inside our homes. So the simplest way for large amounts of compost to be processed is the windrow method that I mentioned earlier. So this is happening right now at the ARVA Try Recycling with all of our yard waste currently. The windrow method is illustrated in this flow chart where you can see the raw waste is pulverized to give it a more uniform particle size and then formed into long piles called windrows. The piles are 4 to 8 feet high and are 14 to 16 feet wide and can be as long as the space can facilitate. They're then aerated mechanically because it's such a large scale. And the size of these piles means they can produce enough heat to continue the decomposition process through the winter. This amount of heat also means that the windrow method can compost almost any organic matter. Large-scale windrow operations have also been used to remediate contaminated soil by excavating the contaminated soil and mixing it into the compost. And then the microbial activity in the large piles can actually break down some of these contaminants. Mostly just included that because it's a neat bioremediation component of composting. It doesn't get rid of all of every contaminant, but it's a cool thing that we can use in a targeted way to help remediate contaminated areas. So outdoor windrow composting and large-scale composting operations in general produce significant amounts of a runoff product called leachate. All composting methods produce leachate as the feedstock is broken down. However, with varied inputs and the sheer volume of material and at-scale operations, leachate can be a pollutant that needs to be managed. It can pollute groundwater and other waterways as well, which is not great. Leachate can contain toxic substances like heavy metals and plasticizers. It does have nutrients in it as well, so it can be remediated into a usable fertilizer potentially. Leachate produced from home composting systems are less likely to be chemically detrimental to your soil, at least in my opinion, but they can harbor pathogenic anaerobic bacteria. Some people use leachate from their home composting to make compost teas, which they then use on their plants. From what I understand, compost tea brewing methods likely eliminate pathogenic bacteria, but without nutrient testing, it's still uncertain which plants the final brew would be suitable for. Really, there's proponents for and critics of making compost tea. So we're going to leave it there for this workshop, but I'm happy to answer questions about that in the question period if people have some interest in that. Sorry, I'm just getting my presentation. There we go. Okay, So there are more automated composting methods that can be used to produce compost faster, some of which can be adapted for home use. Once set up, these methods usually require less mechanical manipulation to maintain decomposition. So the first of which we'll be talking about is called the aerated static pile composting. There's a really handy graphic that illustrates it really well. As the name states, the compost pile remains static, so you're not moving it, while piping systems blow air into the pile from below. A semi-permeable layer of material, usually made of wood chips, is placed at the base of the pile around the piping to allow oxygen to diffuse evenly through the pile. And that's called the plenum layer, as you can see in the graphic here. Well-mixed feedstock is then piled on top to decompose and then covered in a biolayer. The biolayer can be made of finished compost or mulch and functions to discourage pests, reduce odors, and insulate the active compost underneath. So this method can be used to potentially process more compost on less space than the windrow composting method that we discussed. And large-scale operations can be sheltered to mitigate evaporation and any excess moisture from rain. And then they have like moisture and temperature sensors to optimally maintain conditions. However, these can be manually monitored at home with just a compost thermometer and your own hands to feel how wet it is. Yeah, so in an aerated static pile system, the pile should remain hot enough through the winter to continually produce compost through the year. So here you can see an industrial example in the top left of the slide with an array of vacuum tubes under a shelter. And then some people get creative and make their own home systems. This person in the bottom left here added some vertical aeration tubes, whereas this is a neat play on the, I'm sure many of you have seen the 3-tiered composting systems, but this person added an aerated static pile element to that by just putting their aeration tubes at the bottom of the piles there, and then having a blower fan on the back of their system. So it's pretty neat. So when managing an aerated static pile at home, it's important to make sure your feedstock is well balanced between greens and browns, like from the get-go, and relatively homogeneous in size to allow for consistent airflow and decomposition. Since you're not going to be really moving the pile once it's established, you really do want to make sure that your ratio of carbon to nitrogen is set up well from the beginning. So moving on. So in-vessel compost can also scale from home to industrial. In-vessel composting can be done in a concrete-lined drum, silo, or bay that holds compost and allows excellent control of temperature, moisture levels, and airflow. It's mechanically turned and aerated, and little odor or leachate is produced with this method, as biofilter systems are often employed. Large-scale in-vessel composting operations can produce compost in a number of weeks as opposed to months required in other methods we've talked about so far, using even less space. Like the previous methods, in-vessel composting is capable of producing finished compost year-round and can produce process all organic waste inputs. The most common at-home version of the in-vessel composting are these black spinning compost barrels. I'm sure some people have seen these in people's backyards. These sometimes freeze during the winter as their volume isn't very big, but I think you can keep them unfrozen if you're adding things and turning pretty frequently. But there are at-home scale in-vessel composting options that are slightly larger and insulated, like this unit, to produce compost all year round. So this unit in the bottom left of the slide, you can see it's slightly larger and it's got like this insulated jacket on it. And then there's this neat little graphic of how their composting system works. And this company is touting finished compost almost every day after a certain number of weeks in the Redan company composter system. So when you're dealing with this method at home, it's important to harvest the finished compost consistently, as space is more finite in these types of systems. So far, all the methods we've discussed are considered hot composting, which focus on creating conditions for the microorganisms in the pile to metabolize material fast enough to get the temperature of the pile to roughly 140 degrees to eliminate pathogens and kill unwanted seeds. Now we'll talk about another method that can be done in a container small enough to fit in under your kitchen sink at home, all the way up to large indoor facilities. We're talking about vermicomposting. Vermicomposting is composting mediated by worms. Instead of mechanically turning the pile or aerating your feedstock to facilitate microbial decomposition, red worms, or Eisenia fetidae, can perform the same function on their own in containers. As the worms move through and eat the feedstock, they aerate it, and the worm castings they produce have added microorganisms from their digestive tracts. The worms themselves actually aren't doing that much of the composting. However, their biggest contribution is breaking down the organic waste into smaller particles and creating a good environment for the microorganisms to continue decomposing. So they're just doing all the work that you would be doing in turning your compost pile. They're just doing it for you. So 1 pound of these worms can eat half their weight in organic material per day. Properly optimized larger scale operations can produce finished worm castings in as little as 6 weeks, while at-home systems usually take 3 to 6 months. Since vermicomposting occurs at lower temperatures, it's unable to kill weed seeds. However, the digestion process eliminates at least some of the pathogenic bacteria that's potentially present in composting inputs. This isn't such a big deal at home, as indoor small-scale vermicomposting systems are often fed with mostly table scraps, which likely won't have many viable seeds. At larger scales, when dealing with yard waste and more mixed municipal wastes, vermicomposting operations will pre-compost their feedstock for their worm tables by managing hot composting piles and getting the temperature of these feedstocks hot enough to kill most of the seeds before adding it to their immature compost to their vermicomposting systems. So they'll get their inputs up to 140 degrees for like a month, but not finish that compost, and then they'll put it into their piles. So right here in London, actually, the Wormery, located in the Groves at the Western Fair Farmers Market, is an industrial scale vermicomposting operation. Last year, they diverted 60 tons rather of organic waste through their composting program. You can see an example here of their pre-composting pile. It's right in the middle here. So they do that hot composting first before they put that pile into the worm tables. And then their many large worm tables are up here in the top right of the slide. And if you're interested in purchasing finished and tested worm castings, you can buy them from the Wormery. They also sell the kind of worms suitable for indoor vermicomposting to kickstart your own worm composting. Worm composting at home is a great way to compost if you don't have access to outdoor space and to keep composting through the winter. To get started, there are all sorts of vermicomposters purchased online, like this little cute one on the right of the slide here, and lots of DIY examples, such as the one on the left. This Rubbermaid bin one is one of the more popular designs that I've seen. And to do it yourself, you just need to drill aeration holes near the top of the taller bin, so the worms have enough oxygen to survive, and drainage holes on the bottom of the taller bin. Then you're going to secure with waterproof glue some screening covering all the holes to keep the worms and the compost in, but allow excess liquid to escape. You place the taller bin into the shorter bin, and then you're ready to fill your vermicomposter. When filling your vermicomposter from scratch, you'll want to start with enough shredded paper to fill your bin up to 3 inches deep. You're going to wet and drain the paper before you mix it with some moistened soil, about 1 pound. The paper is a good source of carbon, And it also functions to aerate the medium your worms will be living in. The soil and paper medium should be moist but not dripping or forming puddles. And then you can add your worms and put the lid on for a day or so as they kind of just make themselves at home, get used to the environment. And then once they're settled in, you can add your first batch of food scraps. The exact greens to browns ratio isn't quite as important as in hot composting, but you should add some shredded paper along with your food waste when feeding to keep the ratio relatively optimal and to keep your soil aerated. Too much nitrogen can compost too fast and produce odors, and also the heat from this nitrogen-rich, like fast composting actually can harm your worms. So it is important to add that paper in with your food scraps. Sorry. You should only feed your worms about once a week, as they like to be left alone in the dark. When you feed them, use a trowel to make a hole in the medium big enough to fit the scraps you're adding. You're going to dump your scraps and cover them with soil and paper medium, adding more until the worms have produced enough soil to use the existing soil to do so. Leaving the kitchen scraps exposed is a good way to attract fruit flies, so covering it up is really important. Having your scraps broken down into relatively small pieces will yield compost much faster. And when you're doing vermicomposting, don't add any animal byproducts. So stick to vegetables, fruit scraps, tea bags, coffee grounds, stuff like that. You'll need to drain the liquid in the bottom of the bin every month or so. This liquid is another example of leachate, so you can treat that how you decide to treat your leachate. To harvest your vermicompost, when your bin is getting pretty full, feed on only one side of the bin for 2 to 3 weeks, and this will draw most of the worms over to that side. And then you should be able to harvest the unfed side without many worms present. And you can use that finished worm castings in your garden, mixed with potting soil and containers, or just sprinkling it in your yard. Yeah, these worms are not native to our area, so we don't want to introduce them to our soils, as well as you want to keep all your worms in your vermicomposter so they can keep doing the work of composting for you. Now we've got some ideas for different systems that can be used if you're feeling particularly inspired at home, or that can be used at larger scales to deal with our organic waste disposal needs. I hope that's been interesting and potentially gave some of you some usable ideas, but I'd imagine a lot of people here have a bit of outdoor space and are wondering how to just get started composting without having to build any infrastructure. With that in mind, there are a couple of zero infrastructure methods to composting at home, the simplest being trench composting. Trench composting, there's not really much to manage, as the name suggests. You're just digging a trench, putting your compostable material in, and then reburying it, letting all the native microorganisms in your soil do the composting for you. Before digging any trench, obviously, make sure you know where all the gas, water, and electrical lines are underground on your property. And then the compostable material needs to be covered by 8 to 12 inches of soil. So you got to dig down a little bit to get your inputs in there. Burying it all this deep also keeps any unwanted pests away. Depending on how much material you're using and what material is buried, the trench could sink in a bit. So that's something to keep in mind when you're choosing what spot you want to trench compost. In warm conditions, however, you can plant right on top of your trench compost sites in just over a month. Also, the ratio of greens to browns is not quite as important in trench composting. However, adding bulk amounts of nitrogen inputs like grass clippings or manure to your trench can cause it to decompose too hot to plant over in a timely manner. So it's still going to do its thing. You just might not be able to use that space for planting as quickly as you would if it was a more balanced feedstock. If you're including slower decomposing materials like twigs and branches, put these on the bottom of the trench to be able to use the space for planting sooner. You can even compost meat and dairy products with trench composting. So throw it all in, make sure it's moist, and then bury it for some easy enriched soil. One thing to note is you want to try to keep perennial weeds and annual weeds that have gone to seed out of your trench, since it won't get hot enough to neutralize those materials. And one last consideration for trench composting, would be to always keep track of where you've trenched, so you're not digging up partially decomposed material or over amending any areas in your yard. Lastly, let's detail how to start, maintain, and troubleshoot an outdoor compost pile. To start, choose a relatively dry, shady spot in your yard to establish the pile. This will prevent excess moisture evaporation from the pile. Lay down a layer of relatively coarse brown material like straw or wood chips, and that functions the same way as like the plenum layer in the aerated static compost pile. It's going to help oxygen diffuse evenly through the pile. And then you can start layering greens and browns in layers 3 to 4 inches thick, making sure each layer is moistened but not soaking wet. So it should feel like a wrung out sponge is a good way to think about it. Consider covering your open compost with a tarp to limit evaporation and excess moisture due to rain, and then don't let that pile dry out. Your pile will need to be 3 feet cubed to start getting hot. If it's the proper ratio of greens to browns and not too wet, it should start to climb toward 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Once your pile is established in this way, you can start adding inputs by burying them in the pile instead of layering it. And then every 1 to 3 weeks, you should turn your pile, making sure that material that is on the middle of the pile is making it to the outside and vice versa. This ensures that the pile is properly aerated and all materials get to that temperature of 140 degrees, killing all the pathogens and unwanted seeds. You can also use temperature to determine when it's time to turn your pile. Once the temperature starts to drop below 130 degrees, you can turn the pile. If you find that your established compost pile is too wet, we're just going to move on to the troubleshooting, that is. So I found this neat table that has a few different problems, the causes, and what you can do to mitigate those problems. So we're just going to go over a few of those. So yeah, if you're finding that your compost pile is too wet and the temperature won't get hot, you can turn it more frequently to increase aeration. You can also add fine brown material like clean sawdust, straw, or shredded leaves. You can also add peat moss, as this won't affect the carbon to nitrogen ratio, but it is highly moisture absorbent, which can be added. Peat moss has its own environmental concerns, so I'll let you guys make that decision on your own. If your compost does not appear to be broken down and the moisture seems to be at a good level, but the temperature still won't rise, the browns to greens ratio is likely the source of this problem. You likely have too much brown material if you've got a cool pile. So you can add some quick decomposing green material like grass clippings or just some broken up food scraps. I suppose we can talk about the odor problem as well, usually caused by excess nitrogen, which same thing, you just add more browns. If it's too wet, it can get anaerobic, as we discussed. And like I said at the start of the presentation, anaerobic decomposition is pretty stinky. So you're going to want to turn the pile and add some more material. And same goes for lack of oxygen, just aerate that pile. It's turning the pile usually fixes a lot of the problems that you're going to be having with your outdoor composting. As in all composting systems, inputs that are chopped into smaller, more uniform particle sizes will yield finished compost faster and keep the temperature consistent throughout the pile. You can use how the compost looks and the temperature to determine when your compost is finished. Finished compost looks dark and crumbly and has an earthy smell. The pile should be reduced by about half of its original volume. And if you were able to get your pile nice and hot and it looks finished, and the temperature doesn't start to get hotter again after you're turning it, then your compost is ready to use. So it can be pretty labor intensive to maintain an outdoor hot composting pile. And while the expeditious results can be worth it, if you're not able to maintain a hot pile, your composting pile will still break down. It might not kill every weed seed and it might take longer, but with a rough idea of your greens to browns ratio and keeping the factors we've discussed in mind, you'll get compost to use in your garden. Let's just briefly go over in more detail some of the compound household inputs. and make sure we know what you should definitely not put in your outdoor composting pile. So great things to include are fruits and vegetables, eggshells, coffee grounds and filters, tea bags, hair, fur, 100% cotton and wool rags, houseplants that are like the trimmings from your houseplants, as long as they're not diseased or infested with bugs, yard trimmings and grass clippings. So those are all considered greens materials. Some common household browns would be nutshells, shredded paper, cardboard, hay and straw, untreated sawdust, and some wood chips. These are some more things that you don't want to include. Not on this list is this is kind of a gray area, is like oak leaves. They're not toxic or anything, but they do have a lot of lignin in them, which is a protein that doesn't break down very quickly. So if you want to add oak leaves, make sure you're really chopping them up really finely, maybe with a lawnmower, and be judicious with how much you're adding to your pile. So not all leaves are created equal. That's especially illustrated in the case of black walnut. So you don't want to add any black walnut tissues, leaves, twigs, or even the walnuts themselves. They all produce a chemical called juglone, which is an actual herbicide that the black walnut produces. So you'll probably notice that not too much grows around black walnut trees, and that's the main reason for that. And that doesn't get broken down very well in the composting process. So you want to avoid black walnut. You want to avoid adding coal and charcoal ash, as it can release toxic materials that can harm plants. Generally, for your at-home scale outdoor composting pile, you want to avoid dairy and fats, greases, and oils, and meats and fish bones, because these can all they just make the pile smell bad, and they can attract pests. And meat can contain pathogens that will not break down unless the compost pile is large enough, and they can make us sick as well. So pet waste, like used litter, dog and cat feces, these can contain parasites, bacteria, and pathogens that are just not safe for us. Obviously, anything that's treated with a pesticide or an herbicide, you don't want to add to your compost pile, as that can kill the beneficial composting organisms in your pile. And then, as I said before, you don't want any diseased or infected plants, as these can transfer disease to the plants you're using your compost on. And while it's not strictly necessary, it can be a good idea to get your compost tested by organizations like A&L Canada Laboratories, which is located right here in London, or SGS Canada. The branch in Guelph is where you would send your compost off to get tested if you're interested. This way you know exactly what you're adding to your soil, and you can address any deficiencies that might be there using your compost. And it's a good way to make sure that you're actually adding something quality to your soil. So I'm hoping at this point that everyone here is excited to get their own composting system started up. But if you're not able to do that at some point in the future, you can bring your food waste to Urban Roots and contribute to the community compost program there. Thanks to the London Environmental Network Environmental Action Incubator and the City of London, we've been running the program at 21 Northern Ave, diverting nearly 13,000 pounds of organic waste to date. There are 2 bins at the roadside to dump your organics into. We do ask that folks that they don't dump using plastic bags, even if they're labeled compostable. We manage our composting piles just how I described, as just an outdoor hot composting pile. They're quite a bit bigger than 3 feet cubed, though. So we manage these in bays made from concrete blocks, which were graciously placed by the folks at Stone Paradise. We treat all of the food waste inputs from the community as greens, and then use organic spent mushroom substrate from white crest mushrooms as our browns input. And that's what this picture is here. That's just the straw bedding that they grow mushrooms on. So it's laced with mycelium, which is great to add to a compost pile. And the straw is obviously a great source of carbon. The kind folks from White Crust Mushrooms have been instrumental in helping us move our piles where necessary with their tractors while providing us with this high quality carbon-rich straw substrate that I mentioned. We're then able to use our finished compost to supplement our compost needs on the farm to produce our nutritious vegetables and herbs. So that's it for Composting 101. Hope everyone has a more comprehensive picture of the impact of organic waste and what it does to our environment, and that dealing with our organic waste is something that we can each contribute to in a meaningful way. I often find myself questioning what I can do to have an impact on things like climate change, but this is an area where we collectively can actually make a difference in a positive direction. And I hope the tools discussed today help everyone here in doing so. So yeah, thanks for coming, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have.